Good morning, guys. We're going to bring up George Miranda to give us our first talk for today. Let's give him a round of applause.
Good morning, everyone. How are we doing out there? All right, great. So let's kick off the morning by maybe having a round of applause if you enjoyed yesterday's content on stage. What did you think of day one? So I thought there was a lot of really good content yesterday. And I particularly want to call out Chris Short's DevOps is Not War talk, because there were a number of things in that talk that I think are the perfect lead up to the point that I wanted to make. And so I ended up reworking this talk yesterday after seeing yesterday's content. So we'll see how this goes. We're still going to talk about how we talk about disasters. And when I say disaster, what I mean is that perfect storm type scenario, right, where everything went really wrong in just exactly the wrong ways. So you have this big, prolific, visible type outage that, just causes psychological scars and hurt and pain, right? And hopefully this type of event is not something that happens very often, right? I'm talking about the kind of scenario that should happen maybe 0 times per year or like 1 time a year, right? Like not very often. And hopefully nobody's in a place where this is happening very often in your teams. If it is, right, if this happens a lot in your organization, there's some other things we should talk about first, because there's some slightly bigger problems there. But if this is a pretty rare event, then we should talk about how we talk about disasters, because I think it's going to lead us to some really good places, especially when it comes to DevOps adoption. With that, some miscellaneous things. So I will tweet out these slides. You can find me on Twitter at gmiranda23. So you don't need to take pictures or take notes or anything like that. So some quick introductions. Again, my name is George Miranda. I work at PagerDuty. Here's some info about me. What I will say, though, is I am also a sysadmin, right? Most of my career was made as a systems administrator. And it was also starting at the time when we were rolling away from the term systems operator, right, towards sysadmin. And it was before we had titles like infrastructure engineer or SRE or many of the handful of titles we have for that role these days. But at my core, right, I'm a systems person. So anybody else out there identify as a systems person? Raise your hand, right? Slightly more ops than dev, right? Lots of hands, great. So you're my people. Everybody else, like you're still my people too, right? And I think that's because I've had I've worn a lot of different hats in my career. I've done some development work, did databases for a long time. I did some release engineering, lots of automation. And even beyond technical roles, I've been in a lot of different business roles, right? I was in business development. I did product management, product marketing, straight up marketing. And what that means for me is that these days I mostly, like I used to be an engineer, now I just talk about being an engineer. But it's not that bad. Like I still get to dabble a little bit. I'm also a CNCF ambassador. I've written an O'Reilly book. But being an engineer is not my primary day-to-day job. But what that means is that I've been in a lot of different moving parts of an organization, and I've been exposed to a lot of different things. And I think that is one of the reasons that I will always identify as a systems administrator. One of the things that I love about systems roles is that that's where everything comes together, right? Like from an integration standpoint, that's where you're dealing with hardware and software and applications, right? And different programming languages and persistent and non-persistent data, network, storage, right? Like everything that you need to run software in production at scale. Right? It's basically everything that was in Ryan's SRE talk yesterday, right? Systems is sort of where that all comes together. And what that means, right, is that usually in systems, what I see happen to practitioners, and this is not unique to systems, but for my example, what I see happens to a lot of practitioners in this role is that you end up having this really wide breadth of experience, right? Understanding what it means to run software in production, but you also have these areas of expertise, right, that go deep in particular places. And we call this being a T-shaped individual, right? You've got these broad areas of knowledge, but places where you go deep. And it doesn't always look like this, right? Sometimes it's like a little bit more of an M shape, right? And we have a couple of areas of expertise, right? Or maybe it's, like many M's or an overgrown pie, like I don't even know what you call that. But you get the idea, right? It's basically this holistic view of a system and places where you can go deep that are very helpful in certain situations. And so when you're building out a systems team, any managers here, anybody built out a systems team before, right? See some hands. So this is basically what you do, right? You look for overlap in that broad area of expertise, and those places where you go deep, right, where you have deep levels of expertise, you try to build a team that has different areas of focus, right? And those different areas of focus are usually things that are a day-to-day challenge for the team you're trying to assemble, right? And that's how you create a diverse skill set, right, in a particular team, at least in terms of skill set, right? And that brings me around to DevOps, right? So, wow, you really can't see that graphic at all. It's a really good one of a silo being destroyed. So with DevOps, right, raise your hand if you believe that the point of DevOps is to destroy silos. All right, not too many hands, which is good. So I don't really believe that statement either. I don't entirely agree with it anyway, right? I think we say that a lot. We say that we want to destroy silos. But really, I think what we end up doing in DevOps is we create cross-functional teams, right? We get to a place, like DevOps is best when we have a number of T-shaped individuals, right, or M-shaped. And we have a breadth of knowledge that is, what's required to run and operate software in production at scale. But those deep areas of expertise, right, range across software development, right, and operations. And, we do that on the same team, right? So we don't entirely get rid of silos. We don't get rid of those areas of expertise because what's the alternative, right? We all become full-stack engineers, right? Raise your hand. Who feels like a full-stack engineer? When's the last time you wrote a device driver? No hands, right? So it's not that we all learn everything, right? We all still have our areas of expertise and places where we shine. So what that means, right, is that when we develop a DevOps team, it ends up looking a little something like this, right? We all have different areas of expertise, right? We shine in particular places, whether that's in operations, right, or software development, databases, metrics, capacity planning, or so on, right? Or any of the things that we heard up on stage yesterday, right? Security, network, get all of those folks in your on-call rotation. That was a great bit of advice. And what's important to note here, right, is that we still need these deep areas of expertise in order to be functional. And so what DevOps means, right, is rather than, focusing on our particular silos, right, our areas of expertise, what it means is that we all need a holistic view of what it means to run software in production. And DevOps is about building, cross-functional teams, right? It's about learning more than just what is your area of expertise, right? Keeping a view of the big picture. And then communicating with your team in an open way, right? So that you can build empathy when someone is working in an area of expertise that is not your own, right? And you build some trust so that when they need your area of expertise, they're not just going to chuck things over the wall at you, right? You're going to work together collaboratively, effectively. You're going to communicate, and you can trust each other to work in these good cross-functional ways, right? To me, that's the ethos of DevOps. And so I've been thinking about this quite a bit because it's the 10th anniversary of DevOps. I'm actually heading to DevOpsDays Ghent right after this, which is the actual 10th anniversary. And so I've been thinking a lot about where we go next with DevOps, right? Given the things that we have learned, given all the successes and all the failures, right? What does it mean? Where do we go? How do we apply those things? How do we get to the next phase of this practice? And what I think is the fundamentals of what we do will continue to be the same, but maybe the scope and the range will be somewhat different, right? So rather than having a broad area of knowledge that is just what's required to run software in production at scale, I think maybe now that broad area of knowledge will be what it means to run a successful software business. And maybe I feel that way because I'm, an engineer that went business rogue. I mean, I'm up here wearing my blazer, like talking about business things, right? Ha-ha, business. But we all still have our areas of expertise, right? And stay with me for a minute because I think there's actually something here. So I think the way that we start to spread all of the things that we have learned is to do some of what Chris suggested in his talk, right? Which is we need to adopt some things, help the business via process, and also start learning some things that the business has to teach us. So when I say the business, right, what am I talking about? I'm talking about all of those other parts of the organization that you may not necessarily deal with on a day-to-day, right? The C-suite, marketing, legal, PR, sales, right, finance, departments that may not come into contact with engineering very frequently. But there is one place, one area of opportunity where all of these teams have something in common. And that is when you have a really severe technical incident, that sort of perfect storm scenario, that highly visible outage that's very, very damaging, and the business needs to respond, you all have a common cause. And I think that is the perfect opportunity to start building a bridge because it can take us some really good places. So I believe that creating a business incident response plan is the biggest impact and most obvious thing that you can do to start building the bridges that get us to the next phase of DevOps adoption. And to do that, I propose that we start developing that business incident response plan by using the lessons that we've learned from dealing with technical incidents for years and years and years, right? And in the remainder of this talk, I'll show you how we do that. But maybe let's start here, right? What is the biggest disaster that you've been a part of as a practitioner in your career, right? I want you to think back to that incident that you were involved in, right? That super notable, super visible, just everything went wrong in a really big way type scenario. Are you thinking about that, right? Does everybody have an incident? See some nodding heads? All right, so are you starting to remember what that pressure was like? Right? Maybe feeling some of that anxiety. All right, don't dwell on that. Stay with me. I don't want to lose you. But I want you to have that incident in your mind. Maybe a less emotional way to do that is to take a step back, right? Maybe not an incident that you were involved in as a practitioner, but as a user, right? What was one of the worst incidents that was really visible to you? Yesterday, Quintessence picked on Slack, right? So let's pick on Slack again. Do you remember when Slack was unavailable for a few hours, right? When was the last time that happened? And how did you react, right? It's like, oh my God, suddenly you had no idea how to contact anyone. It's like cell phones and email never even existed. What am I even supposed to do? Everything just grinds to a halt, right? And I think there are several notable examples of this, right? Maybe it's not Slack. Maybe it's your favorite online source control manager, right? What happened when it was unavailable for the better part of half a day and nobody could check in code and nobody could be productive, right? And everything just grinds to a halt. So, right, when that happens on the inside, your customers feel the same way about your services that you just felt about those examples, right? When those things go wrong, especially if these are services or systems that you're paying quite a bit of money for, right? When they go down, when they have these big visible outages in that sort of way, they create real pain for your customers, right? It's the same anxiety, but maybe felt in a different way. So these types of incidents cause real reputational damage to your business. And so when these things occur, the business needs to respond. All right, when that happens, raise your hand. Do you have a plan in place for what the business is supposed to do, right? You probably have a plan for the technical side. Any hands, right, for what you do from the business side? All right. Are those plans well documented? Keep your hand up. Are those plans practiced and often? Right? So I still see a couple of hands. Congratulations. So in those scenarios, right, you have to practice these plans. It's sort of like having a backup and restore, right? How do you know the backup works unless you restore it? How do you know the plan works unless you actually practice this often? And hopefully you're not practicing it often because it's happening for real that often, right? So it's easy for me to say this, but did I have this in my organization? Did PagerDuty have it? No, we did not, right? And so, we didn't have it because PagerDuty is highly available, right? Like, we're never down. Like, that's never going to happen to us. So we need a plan like this. And nobody ever thinks it's going to happen to them until it does. And when this happened at PagerDuty, what happened is, technical responders, we deal with things like this all the time. So we knew what to do from a technical perspective. But when it was clear that there was a real business need to respond and do something, right? From the business side, what we saw was a lot of ad hoc chaos and scrambling and just uncertainty of things that you should do. Right? The business needed to mitigate some of this, reputational damage that was occurring, and rather than having an organized response, everybody just scrambled. And what happens in scenarios when people just scramble, right? You get things like this, right? Somebody joins the incident call, maybe it's an executive, maybe it's your CEO, right? And you get comments like this, right? You have this big, prolonged outage, and the business has no idea what to do. And so interactions like this, I think, tend to come from a very benign place, right? Or they're well-meaning, well-intentioned. But, what are you supposed to do with that, right? Yeah, all right, so this was going to take at least an hour to diagnose, but because you said that, great, I'll fix it in 10 minutes, right? Like Scotty on Star Trek, right? Like I, Captain. What is that even supposed to do? So it's demoralizing, right, as a technical responder. It's distracting, and worse, it's actually actively getting in our way of being able to resolve a technical incident, right? And unless you have a plan for dealing with that, things like this, that chaos has a way of disrupting our jobs and keeping us from responding to incidents effectively. But this happens, right, because business stakeholders see a problem that they need to respond to, and they don't really know what to do. So essentially, right, interactions like this are a moment of executive panic. Just in terms of background, I'm a trained EMT and first responder. Emergency response is kind of my jam. I have reasons for that. Ask me about that sometime. But the point that I wanted to make with this slide is that emergency preparedness actually plays a really big role in navigating emergencies successfully. Emergency preparedness research has shown time and again that if you have a plan for how you're going to respond to an emergency, you are an order of magnitude more likely to do the right thing in an emergency scenario. Right? During that emergency, it might not go according to plan, but because you actually had the foresight to develop that muscle memory and that mental acuity before it actually mattered, in that moment of crisis, you're 10x more likely to do the right thing and navigate that situation successfully. But let's bring this around to the DevOpsy part, right? So at PagerDuty, what we did is we took the response practices that we use for technical incidents, and we started to share those lessons with the rest of the organization so that they could understand what they should do to manage business incidents effectively. Does anybody here use the incident command system to manage incidents, where you have an incident commander that takes charge for major incidents? Anybody using a system like that? Great, I see some hands. Not as many hands as I would like, right? So let's do a quick aside. So the short version, PagerDuty did not invent the incident command system. That was invented by Cal Fire in the 70s. But it's basically an incident response framework for managing all sorts of emergency scenarios. It's used internationally. It's used in a number of places. We've adopted that or adapted that to fit the needs of technical incidents. So if you take nothing else away from this talk, take this, right? If you are not using a system like ICS to manage your technical incidents, you could be doing it in a better, smoother, more humane way. So if you'd like to read a little bit more about that or understand how to set that up, I'm just going to go ahead and plug this here. We have a great open source response guide for this. It's not product specific. It's all about process. You can take this framework, fork it, and adapt it to meet the needs of your teams. And it'll show you basically how industry-leading practices work to navigate incident response patterns, right? My team specifically at PagerDuty maintains a number of these guides. We do a lot of stuff like this. So if you want to talk about this, please hit me up. I'm here at the conference all day. But I'm going to go into the weeds for just a minute in terms of what this process looks like when you use it, right? So this is pretty much what it looks like when you use the incident command system to manage an incident, right? You've got an incident commander that's basically in charge and kind of driving the incident's resolution. You've got some folks that are helping, like a scribe that's taking notes, a deputy that's more or less an assistant. You've got these communications folks that are managing stakeholder communications and customer communications. And really, the reason you have all these folks at the top is to create space for subject matter experts, right? All of you folks in the room that we wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning to look at these things, right? It creates space for you to do your job effectively without folks breathing down your neck, right? That's what all the other folks in this structure are for. And so when an incident goes on for quite a while, right, we know that we get to that perfect storm scenario because we've defined a very explicit set of criteria around what it means to have the type of impact where we know this is going to be very big if it's not already in a way that is going to cause that sort of reputational damage, right? So if we feel like we are getting to that place, right, those metrics are either about to be crossed or we've already crossed that threshold, what happens is on our incident response calls, we basically page a business subject matter expert, right? We get a technical member of the senior leadership team. So this would be somebody like your CTO, right? VP of engineering, head of product, right? Senior engineering managers. But somebody in a business-facing role that's also very technical that can join the call to understand what is happening with this incident, right? Is a broader company response required, right? Are there things that more parts of the business need to do? And if they deem that that is the case, what happens is that SME grabs a technical subject matter expert that's been on the call that understands the incident, and they basically spin off and create a business incident that brings together all those other parts of the organization, right? Including your executives, right? The C-suite, including folks from sales, marketing, right? PR, press. There's actually more boxes here that can fit. And one of the things that I want to call out is that all of these roles are on-call rotations with backups, right? That means that, yes, at PagerDuty, our CEO is on call, right? And has a backup in that role in case our CEO is unavailable for any reason, right? Who else can make those critical decisions in this moment of crisis? And so I'll give you an example of just like the kinds of things that a group like this needs to do, right? So let's say you have a software product, right? Or a technical service that people pay you for. That probably also means that you have a sales team that's out there trying to get people to buy the product that you put out. So if you have a moment where your product is broken, right, you probably want to let your salespeople know, hey, you probably shouldn't be doing that demo right now, right? That's not going to go very well. Or marketing, for example, right? Marketing always has outbound campaigns that are trying to funnel people into trying your product. The worst time for anybody to try that product is when it's broken, right? So there are a number of other things you need to do in this sort of scenario, right? How you communicate with customers, other things you can do, right? But that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg, right? You get the idea. So let's finally bring this around to the DevOps-y part, right? So here's where I think all of this stuff matters, because the results that I have seen as a part of implementing this process internally at PagerDuty are kind of mind-blowing. So support for chaos engineering around the organization is through the roof, right? And that is because as part of putting together this plan, what we've done is we've worked with these cross-functional sections of the organization in game day scenarios, right? We don't actually force a horrible failure of PagerDuty, but what we do is we take these past incidents that we pretend rather than getting resolved in an hour, it took 12 hours. All right, team, go. Right? How do you fix this? And as a result of going through those practice exercises, we've refined the practice, right? We've identified gaps, and now across the organization, you see a broad appreciation for doing these sort of live fire drills to make processes better. There is a lot of excitement around running blameless postmortems. I say that it's just awareness because, like, knock on wood, since we did this, we haven't actually had one of these processes for real. But other parts of the non-engineering organization, right, are starting to see the value in having processes like this. What they have done, specifically I've seen this with the communications group, is a big adoption of retrospectives, right? Looking at the process that we just went through, right? Doing an agile type review of things that worked and things that didn't, and figuring out how you make it better for the next iteration, right? We've seen a big adoption of retros. And then probably the biggest mind-blowing one for me is that now what I see are other parts of the organization peeking in to see, hey, what's happening over in engineering, right? I have a PR person that joins our technical incident calls to listen to, hey, like, what does an incident commander actually sound like? What do they do? Well, how are technical incidents resolved? They're starting to learn more about our technical stack, right? Even though this has absolutely nothing to do with their job. As a result, actually, in return, I've learned a lot about PR processes and how we deal with bad stories, or how we interact to get messages out there. But what we're starting to see is sort of this cross-pollination of roles, right? And the reason that I bring this up is, again, it's because of something that Chris said, right? Which I think is pretty on the money, right? When you are trying to change practices and proliferate DevOps adoption, right? It's the fear of something new, right? DevOps, that makes conflict possible and puts up these roadblocks and stops that proliferation of knowledge. So I believe that creating a business incident response plan is the biggest impact thing and the most obvious place to start when it comes to pushing DevOps across your organization, right? Because what that does is it creates a common framework, right? We operate in the same ways. What we're doing in this approach, right, is we are taking those things that we know have improved our practice, and we're familiarizing other parts of the organization with how they work, right? That removes fear, that removes conflict, and that starts to build bridges between silos in ways that end up being pretty unexpected, right? And when you do that, what it ends up doing is creating empathy, right, for other deep areas of expertise that are not your own, and trust that when folks are running, with that deep expertise, or when they need yours, you'll find ways to collaborate, right? It creates less executive soup. It creates, just more visibility into things that are happening, and I think that's about as DevOpsy as it gets, right? So to do that, I propose that we start by developing our own internal business incident response plans. And so my team has created an operational guide for how you do that as well. It's a very, very good step-by-step way to start addressing some of those needs. And I believe that we can help you do that. So I'll just end it here, right? In case you aren't aware, this is what the community team at PagerDuty does. We write a lot of step-by-step guides to how do you do some of these things that we all talk about. My favorite example of that is postmortems. We talk about blameless postmortems a lot, but how do you actually do it, right? Check out the postmortems guide. Things like language that you should use versus language that you shouldn't use, biases that you need to overcome, right? How you actually run the meeting, who you invite, step-by-step ways. They're open source. You can fork these repos. You can change the process. You can make it suit the needs of your team. But I at least hope that you'll come talk to us, tell us what you're doing, and maybe as an industry, we can all kind of develop these practices together. So that's it. That's all I've got. So thank you for your time.